Okay, so get ready. Today we are diving deep into some seriously complex global issues.
We are. And what I find so fascinating about the notes that you've assembled here is how they connect all these, seemingly completely separate issues into this, well, coherent picture of the world.
Yeah, and I think what really struck me, and I'd love to kind of get your take on this, is this idea that climate change, which we often think of as like an environmental concern, it's actually like a catalyst for instability and conflict, especially in regions that are already facing, a lot of other challenges.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key takeaways from kind of, all the material that you've been looking at is that climate change exacerbates existing vulnerabilities, whether we're talking about, economic inequality or political
Yeah.
instability. It just acts as this threat multiplier.
Right. It's like it takes all these existing tensions and just like pours gasoline on them.
Exactly. Exactly. And you see this playing out in so many ways, but I know you were particularly struck by the statistics on CO2 levels.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh,
yeah. That was like the first thing that jumped out at me. A 47% increase since the Industrial Revolution.
I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. 47%, that's like hitting fast forward on thousands of years of natural change.
Right. And we're already seeing the consequences. Like, it's not some distant threat, it's happening now.
Exactly. We're talking melting ice caps, rising sea levels, more extreme weather events. All of these things are happening right now. And frankly, the scientific consensus is overwhelming. You have organizations like the IPCC, the American Meteorological Society, all saying the same thing. This is real, it's happening, and it's largely driven by human activity.
Yeah. And, it's easy to get lost in the global picture, but what really hit home for me was how this is playing out in a place like Pakistan, a country that I know you're, particularly interested in.
Right. And what's happening in Pakistan is really a microcosm of what we're seeing globally.
Right. Like that stat about the Arabian Sea temperature increases. I mean, 4 million acres of agricultural land lost to the sea. That's an area larger than the entire state of Connecticut, just gone.
It's staggering, and it really highlights the vulnerability of these coastal regions. And it's not just rising sea levels. Pakistan is also facing these increasingly erratic rainfall patterns.
Yeah, you highlighted the situation in Sindh province, going from barely any rain in 2018 to like record-breaking floods the following year.
It just shows how climate change makes everything more unpredictable, more extreme. And for a country like Pakistan that relies so heavily on agriculture, these fluctuations can be devastating.
It's like the country is being squeezed from both sides, rising seas on one end, unpredictable rainfall on the other.
Exactly. And that's why it's so encouraging to see Pakistan taking some proactive steps, like that billion tree tsunami project you
Oh
mentioned.
yeah, that caught my eye too. It's amazing what they're doing.
It is. And it's not just about planting trees. They're also trying to transition to renewable energy sources, investing in things like solar and wind power.
So trying to, mitigate the problem at the source, which is, obviously crucial, but you also mentioned something in your notes that I hadn't really considered before. Climate change as a security threat.
Right. And this is something that often gets overlooked, but it's becoming increasingly important. Climate change is a threat multiplier.
A threat multiplier. What does that mean exactly?
It means that it takes existing security threats and makes them worse. So think about it. As resources become more scarce, as populations are displaced, as countries face more extreme weather events, the potential for conflict increases dramatically.
So it's not just about the environment. It has these huge geopolitical ramifications.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it such a complex issue to address, because it requires cooperation, it requires global action, and frankly, it requires us to rethink the way we approach security in the 21st century.
It's a whole new world order, or maybe a world disorder.
Well, on that note, I think it's a perfect segue to our next topic, which is the changing landscape of international relations. Because as the world grapples with these challenges, the old rules are being rewritten.
Yeah, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the relationship between the U.S. and China.
Right. The two, well, I guess you could call them superpowers, are locked in this increasingly tense rivalry, and it's impacting everything from trade and technology to security and global governance.
It's like the world is holding its breath, wondering what's going to happen next.
And it's not just about what happens between the U.S. and China. Other players are starting to assert themselves as well.
Yeah, it's like the whole global chessboard is being shaken up.
And figuring out who the winners and losers will be in this new world order, well, that's the million-dollar question.
It is, and it's one that we're going to unpack in much greater detail. But first, I think we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, so we're back and we're unpacking all of these complex global issues. And I think, one of the things that we really need to delve into is this idea of water security. Because as your notes point out, this is a major challenge in a lot of parts of the world, especially in regions like South Asia.
Absolutely. Water's becoming increasingly scarce,
Mhm.
and that's only going to be exacerbated by climate change.
Right. And you highlighted the situation between Pakistan and Afghanistan, two countries that share, this vital resource, the Kabul River, but they also have this, long history of mistrust and frankly, conflict.
It's a classic example of how water can become a flashpoint between nations, especially as climate change disrupts rainfall patterns and melts glaciers, the sources of these rivers.
Right. It's like that old saying, whiskey is for drinking, but water is for fighting over.
Exactly. And you see this playing out in the case of the Kabul River, where you have these competing demands for water, for irrigation, for drinking water, for industry.
And then you throw in the whole issue of the Shatut Dam.
Right. That's a perfect example of how these tensions can escalate.
Right.
Afghanistan sees the dam as essential for its own development, for providing electricity and irrigation to its people.
But Pakistan's worried that it's going to reduce the flow of the Kabul River even further, which could have devastating consequences for its own population.
It's a complex situation, and there are no easy answers, but one thing is clear.
Hmm.
Both countries need to find a way to cooperate if they want to avoid a full-blown water crisis.
So how do you even begin to build that kind of cooperation, especially given the historical baggage? You mentioned hydrodiplomacy earlier. What does that look like in practice?
Well, it starts with dialogue, with open communication, and a willingness to understand the other side's perspective and their needs.
So sitting down at the table, even when it's difficult, even when there's been a lot of mistrust in the past.
Exactly, because the alternative, conflict over water, is in no one's interest.
It's a lose-lose situation for everyone involved.
Precisely. So hydrodiplomacy is about finding those win-win solutions, whether it's through joint management of water resources, data sharing, or even collaborative projects like building new reservoirs that benefit both countries.
So it's about moving away from that zero-sum game mentality and towards a more cooperative approach.
Exactly. Because in the 21st century, we're all in this together. And water is a resource that we need to share if we want to survive and thrive as a global community.
It's a powerful message. And speaking of cooperation, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another important relationship for Pakistan, its partnership with China, which you describe in your notes as like a cornerstone of its foreign policy.
It is, and it's a fascinating relationship, one that's rooted in both shared interests and a degree of necessity.
Right, because you have these two countries that have, very different histories, different political systems, but they've managed to forge this really strong bond over the years.
And it's a bond that's been tested time and again, but it's endured. And I think a big part of that is that they both see each other as reliable partners in a world that's becoming increasingly uncertain and, frankly, hostile to their interests.
So they have each other's backs, so to speak.
To a certain extent, yes,
Right.
but it's also a relationship that evolves over time. And I think, the biggest symbol of that evolution is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, as it's commonly known.
Right, CPEC, that's the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that's supposed to transform Pakistan's economy, connect it to China and the rest of the world.
It's the flagship project of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And it's really a game changer, not just for Pakistan, but for the entire region.
Okay, so break it down for me, because I know it involves a lot of roads and ports and pipelines, but what's the big picture here? What's the ultimate goal?
The goal is to turn Pakistan into this vital economic hub, a gateway connecting China to the Middle East, Africa, and beyond.
So Pakistan becomes like this central node in this new global trade network.
Exactly. And it's not just about trade. CPEC also includes energy projects, industrial zones, and even agricultural cooperation.
So it's about, lifting Pakistan's economy, creating jobs, modernizing its infrastructure.
All of that, but it's also about China securing its own economic and strategic interests, because let's be honest, China doesn't do anything altruistically.
Right, they're playing the long game.
Always, and CPEC is a perfect example of that. It's about securing access to resources, to markets, and to strategic shipping lanes.
So it's a win-win situation.
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Because while CPEC has the potential to be transformative, it's also sparked its fair share of controversy.
Well, that's what makes this so interesting. We're not just talking about, some abstract geopolitical theory here. This is real life with real challenges and real risks.
And that's what we're here to unpack. So let's dive into those controversies, shall we? Because I know you had some questions about the whole debt trap diplomacy argument.
Yeah, that's something I've heard a lot about, and frankly, it's a little concerning. So explain it to me. What are the concerns about Pakistan's growing debt to China?
The concern is that China is using CPEC to saddle Pakistan with unsustainable debt,
Yeah.
that they're essentially using these loans as leverage to gain political and economic influence.
So it's like, we'll help you build your economy, but you'll owe us big time, and we'll call in those favors when it suits us.
That's the fear, and it's not entirely unfounded because we've seen this pattern play out in other parts of the world where countries have gotten in over their heads with Chinese loans and have been forced to make concessions that compromise their sovereignty.
So is Pakistan headed down that same path, or is this just, Western propaganda, as some people claim?
It's a complex issue, and the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between.
Okay, so let's unpack it because I want to understand both sides of this argument.
Absolutely, because that's the only way to really make sense of what's going on. And frankly, it's something that Pakistan is going to have to grapple with for years to come.
Because CPEC is not going away anytime soon?
Not at all. It's too big, too important, both for Pakistan and for China.
So buckle up because this is going to be a bumpy ride.
You could say that again, but hey, that's what makes geopolitics so fascinating, right? It's like a giant game of chess, but the stakes are real.
And speaking of high stakes, I think we need to talk about another major player in this region, one that has the potential to either stabilize or completely upend the balance of power, and that's Saudi Arabia.
Right, and we can't talk about Saudi Arabia without talking about its arch rival, Iran, because those two countries are locked in this epic struggle for regional dominance.
It's a rivalry that goes back centuries, and it's about more than just, oil or territory. It's about religion. It's about ideology. It's about who gets to shape the future of the Middle East.
And increasingly, it's about who gets to shape the future of the world, because both Saudi Arabia and Iran are projecting their power far beyond their borders.
So how does Pakistan fit into this equation? Because they have this close relationship with Saudi Arabia, but they also share a border with Iran.
Right, it's a delicate balancing act, and it's one that Pakistan has been navigating for decades.
But it seems like it's getting even more complicated as the region becomes more polarized, as the U.S. and China vie for influence. It's like Pakistan is caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war.
It is. And it's a position that presents both challenges and opportunities, because if Pakistan can play its cards right, it could emerge as a key player in this new world order.
All right, so let's dive into that because I want to understand how Pakistan can navigate these choppy waters and come out on top.
Well, it starts with understanding the stakes, the players, and the potential pitfalls. And that's what we're going to explore in more detail right after the break.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about this epic rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I gotta say, it's like a masterclass in geopolitics.
It really is. And it's one of those rivalries that has implications far beyond the Middle East, because both Saudi Arabia and Iran are major players on the global stage.
Right, and they've both got, these deep pockets. They're both vying for influence. They're both, supporting different sides in these proxy conflicts.
And let's not forget the religious dimension, the Sunni-Shia divide, which adds this whole other layer of complexity to the mix.
Right, it's like this ancient feud, but it's playing out in the 21st century with, modern weapons and globalized media, and frankly, it's a little scary.
It is, and it's something that the international community has been struggling to manage for decades with limited success, frankly.
And in the middle of all of this, you have Pakistan, which, as you pointed out, has this delicate balancing act to perform.
Absolutely, because Pakistan has close ties to Saudi Arabia, but they also share a border and a complex history with Iran, so they can't afford to alienate either side.
It's like they're walking a diplomatic tightrope.
Exactly, and it's a tightrope walk that requires a lot of skill, a lot of nuance, and frankly, a little bit of luck.
So how do they do it? How do they maintain these relationships without, falling off the tightrope?
Well, it's about finding that balance. Right? It's about emphasizing shared interests, about promoting dialogue, about trying to, be a bridge builder rather than a divider.
So is Pakistan like the Switzerland of the Middle East?
I wouldn't go that far, but there's definitely an element of that, this idea of trying to remain neutral, of trying to be a voice of reason in a region that's often driven by emotion and, frankly, ancient grudges.
It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it, right?
Right. And Pakistan, given its history and its position in the region, is probably one of the few countries that can actually play that role.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, some of the more positive aspects of Pakistan's position in the world, because in your notes you talked a lot about its potential as a trade hub, as a key player in this new globalized economy.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about Pakistan. It's got this incredible potential to be a bridge between East and West, a central node in this new Silk Road.
Right, and you talked about CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as being a key part of that.
It is, because CPEC is not just about, building roads and ports. It's about creating this whole new economic ecosystem, one that connects China to the Middle East, to Central Asia, to Africa.
So Pakistan becomes like this central hub, this place where everyone wants to do business.
Exactly. And that's a huge opportunity for Pakistan. But it's also a challenge, because in order to realize that potential, they need to create a business-friendly environment. They need to tackle corruption. They need to invest in education and infrastructure.
So it's about more than just, signing deals and building things. It's about like building a foundation for sustainable economic growth.
Precisely. And that's going to require some serious reforms, some tough decisions. But if Pakistan can pull it off, the rewards could be enormous.
It's a big if, but, from what I've seen in your notes, Pakistan has a history of defying the odds.
They do, and I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, because we're not just talking about, some abstract geopolitical theories here. We're talking about real people, real challenges, and real opportunities.
And I think that's a great place to wrap up this conversation, because it's been a whirlwind tour of, some of the most pressing issues facing the world today.
It has, and I hope it's left our listeners with a better understanding of the complexities, the challenges, but also the opportunities that exist in this ever-changing global landscape.
Absolutely, because as we said at the beginning, these issues they're interconnected, they're constantly evolving, and there are no easy answers.
But by engaging with these issues, by trying to understand the different perspectives, by having these difficult conversations, we can hopefully start to find a way forward.
And on that note, I think we're gonna wrap up this deep dive, but remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
Not at all. In fact, it's just beginning.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter most.
Because the world needs more informed citizens, more engaged citizens, and frankly, more people who are willing to dive deep.
And on that note, we'll see you next time.